All right, I'd like to continue the discussion now about with this general chemistry stuff, and talk a little bit more about inorganic and organic chemistry here. And again, just to review, when I say organic, bear in mind I'm talking about anything that is carbon based, and when I say inorganic, I'm referring to materials that are non-carbon based. Okay, so some examples of carbon-based molecules would be a carbohydrate, a protein, okay, a lipid, a nucleic acid, okay, and examples of non-carbon based, carbon dioxide. Okay, this is one of the few things that have compounds that have carbon in it, but are not actually considered technically organic. Okay, water. As important as water is, it is non-carbon based. Okay, there is no carbon in there. Table salt, sodium chloride. Okay, non-carbon based. Okay, that would be inorganic. So keep that in mind. All right, organic versus inorganic. Okay, now as we kind of move along, I spent in the first presentation, I spent a long time talking about a lot of inorganic substances, and I'd like to continue that by talking a little more about water. Okay, water is by far the most common and important inorganic compound found in living organisms. Okay, and it makes up well over 60% of our total body composition. Okay, that's a lot. All right, so we could say that. The average 150-pound male could have up to 40 liters of water within himself. So the question you should be asking yourself then is, where in the world is all that 40 liters of water? Okay, and that water is going to be, obviously, you're going to think blood. Okay, there's water in the tissues. Okay, we call that interstitial fluid. Okay, and then there's also intracellular water. Okay, the bulk of the water in the human body is found within the cells of our body because, those cells are our functional units. Okay, cells are, we have a lot of cells in our body, therefore there's a lot of water within them. Okay, then the cells are bathing in water as well. Okay, and then we circulate water around to transport gases and nutrients to our tissues. Okay, so one of the biggest parts of staying alive is maintaining water balance. Okay, circulating water around the body to, make sure we're constantly replenishing our tissue fluids with nutrients and removing waste from them. Okay, to ensure that the water inside the cells is always filled with the right nutrients, so the cell can carry out their jobs, plain and simple. Okay, and the beauty of water is that it's a very dynamic substance. When I say it's very dynamic, there's a lot of unique properties to it that allow us to, that can drive our, diverse functions of life. Okay, one of the important properties of water is its high heat capacity. So when we say it has a high heat capacity, what we're saying here is that it can absorb a lot of heat and release a lot of heat, and there's very little change in its temperature. Okay, because you have to remember the boiling point of water is about 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, we're never going to reach that type of a temperature. That's just way too hot. Most humans will be close to dying at about 105 degrees. Okay, so that's a very nice thing, is that we can absorb a lot of, the water in our body can absorb a lot of heat. Okay, because one thing about chemical reactions, as our metabolism and chemical reactions occur, heat is released. Okay, I should say, whenever we have exergonic or catabolic metabolic reactions, remember those would be reactions where we break a chemical bond. Okay, there's always going to be heat released from that. Okay, and what's nice is that the water of our body can absorb that heat, okay, with very little change to its overall composition, which is nice. Okay, so, and that's how we heat ourselves. And the more metabolically active tissues of the body, the muscle tissues of our body, they generate lots of heat. Okay, so then that heat is then circulated around the body via the bloodstream. Okay, so we circulate that heat around, and which is nice because being that blood is a very important mechanism to keeping ourselves warm. We can reroute blood flow depending on the type of environment we're in. As I mentioned in the chapter 1 lecture, when we get really cold, we shiver. Remember the thermostat example I talked about? Okay, and in that situation, when we get really cold, we're going to increase blood flow to our core. When I say core, think of your brain, your thoracic and your abdominal organs. Okay, so we're going to increase blood flow to those organs, and we're going to carry by increasing blood flow, we increase heat circulation to those areas. Okay, so as a result, we can keep these major organs warm, and then our muscles can contract. That's shivering. So as your muscles shiver and they rhythmically contract more often, they're going to generate more heat, and that's how we heat ourselves when we're really cold. Okay, vice versa, if we get really hot, okay, we can circulate that heat to our skin. Oops, can't write off of the slide. We circulate that heat to our skin, and then as a result, what we do is we sweat. Okay, you have to remember, sweat is water. Sweat is, when we sweat, we lose, blood volume. Okay, so what's happening is we sweat this water onto the surface of our skin. Okay, and then that water evaporates off of our skin, and then as the water evaporates off of our skin or falls off, whatever it is you're doing, the heat goes with it, and we can cool ourselves. Okay, which is a very cool, no pun intended there, heating mechanism, but at the same time, it's not something we can sustain for too long because excessive sweating leads to excessive water loss. Okay, that's why if you do sweat a lot, you have to rehydrate yourself. Okay, and this is nice because this, being that water has this high heat capacity, we can use it in this way, and that also prevents sudden changes in our temperature. If our metabolism does get too high or too low, okay, we can maintain a relatively constant body temperature due to water's heat capacity, and we can adapt to temperature changes as well because of this, which is really nice. All right, and that kind of covered the second bullet point on here as well. All right. So water is also, I mentioned this a little earlier, and I'm going to bring this up again. I can't mention this enough. It's important. Water is the universal solvent. Okay, when we say it's the universal solvent, it means that basically anything polar, okay, can potentially be dissolved in water. Okay, remember, when we say polar, we mean charged. Okay, because remember, when you look at the chemical composition of water, okay, you have a big oxygen that's predominantly negatively charged, and then you've got two hydrogen atoms that are positive charge. So water is a polar molecule. Okay, so, and a big part, when we look at our body fluid composition, a very common component of our fluid composition are ions. Okay, ions, charged elements like sodium. Okay, chloride. There's a little bit of calcium here or there, a little bit of magnesium here or there, not much, but primarily sodium is going to be found out there. And then within the cells, you're going to find a lot of potassium. Okay, and which is nice because, okay, so that means that being that water is polar and these are polar, they can react with one another because, as you remember from the previous talk, opposites attract. Okay, because they need to in order to gain some form of chemical or neutral balance. Okay, remember, positively charged ions are missing an electron, and negatively charged ions have too many electrons. So opposing charged elements or molecules have something to gain from one another, getting rid of or accepting, excess electrons. Okay. So it's nice then because, we can essentially dissolve any electrolyte in water. Okay. And remember how water molecules behave. If I was to put some table salt in this water, okay, remember ionic bonds, as I mentioned earlier, are relatively weak chemical bonds. Okay, so what's going to happen then is this water molecule is going to physically separate, okay, the two parts of this table salt. All right, and remember let's remember sodium ion is positively charged, so the oxygen part of the water is going to be facing the sodium. Okay, and then the hydrogen portions will be facing away. Okay, and then with the take the chloride, and then it's going to be the exact opposite. Okay, you're going to have the water surrounding it, and the positively charged pole, the hydrogen ions, are going to face this negatively charged pole. All right, so it's nice because we can separate these electrolytes, and then we can use them for various functions in our body. I mean, you're going to learn as we go throughout the quarter, the importance that sodium has in many aspects of our physiologic, well, our homeostasis. Okay. Um, and also bear in mind, water can also mix with large charged molecules, large polar molecules like proteins. Okay, remember at the kind of towards the beginning of the first lecture, I talked a little bit about colloids. Okay, colloidal solutions. Okay, remember all a colloid is basically, think of a colloid as a protein mixed in water. I mean, remember Jello. Okay, so if I take this big protein and stick it in water, these smaller waters are going to kind of stick inside the coils of here, okay, of this protein, and then as a result, but there's still going to be a little bit of water kind of found around the protein. All right, so as a result, you're going to form a gel, not exactly a solid, not exactly a liquid. Okay, and what's nice about these colloids or these sticky these gels is that they're relatively sticky. Okay, which means we're talking about connective tissue here. Okay, so we form a very diverse type of tissue inside of our body by mixing proteins in water. All right, and then as I mentioned earlier, being that water can mix so well with so many, being that it is a universal solvent, it would make sense that it's our main transport medium as well, i.e., blood. Okay, just remember, I mean, you guys know that lipids and water, that they don't mix, okay, because fats are non-polar, they're non-charged. Water is polar, okay, nothing to gain from one another, so they do not mix with one another. But the beauty of this is we can still circulate, because remember, there are certain hormones, like for example steroid hormones, are made out of fat. Okay, they're derived from cholesterol. Okay, so how do we circulate? So then how do we circulate a fat-based hormone around our watery blood? Well, we can get around that by, we can stick this fat to a protein, the proteins can mix in the water, and then we can circulate that fat hormone around the body while it's stuck to what we call a carrier protein. So that's the nice thing about water being so universal in its solvency, is that we can transport essentially anything throughout our system. Even if it doesn't directly mix with water, we can still stick it to a molecule that does and circulate it around the body. So that's the beauty of water, as being a universal solvent. Okay. Water is also reactive. Water takes place in chemical reactions, specifically reactions called hydrolysis or dehydration synthesis. Okay, and these are essentially reactions, basically where we break a chemical bond and we strip some hydrogen and oxygen off of a couple molecules and we end up forming water, or we end up taking hydrogens and oxygens and sticking them together to, like for example, to link a couple sugars together, and we call that dehydration synthesis. Okay, so basically this would be a decomposition, this would be a synthesis reaction. Okay, but that's all we're saying here, is that we can either form water by breaking a chemical bond, or we can lose a little bit of water via sticking hydrogens and oxygens together. Okay, because we do produce a little bit of water of our total body composition does come from our metabolism, but not a significant amount. That's why we have to drink it on a day-to-day basis. Okay, water does act as a cushion. Okay, but I wouldn't really, the cerebral spinal fluid example, I put this on here just because this isn't the best example in the world. Just because there is not a lot of cerebral spinal fluid around your brain and your spinal cord. It's such a thin coat that it doesn't really act as that good of a cushion. But if you think of all the water in your tissue spaces, okay, if you take some physical force, that water is going to absorb that, and that's going to prevent that tissue from compressing and becoming damaged too much. Okay, same thing, within the brain, the cushioning aspect of this comes from the ventricles. You're going to learn about this much later on. within the brain. There are these hollow cavities that are filled with water. Okay, so if we get cracked in the brain, if we take blunt force trauma, that energy is going to travel into the water in these cavities, and that'll prevent the brain from just completely slamming against your skull. Okay, but you don't have a lot of water surrounding your brain. It's not like it's submersed in water and it's buoyant by any means. So those are the major functions of water, and again, these are extremely important because, these functions are what drive our life. And as I mentioned earlier, maintaining water balance means we're maintaining life. Okay, that's why it's so critical that we do maintain water balance on a day-to-day basis. And as we get more into A&P2 and you learn about the cardiovascular system and you learn about water, acid-base, electrolyte balance, I mean, you're going to come back to all of this stuff, these basic properties of water and how it actually works. Okay, so and that kind of leads me into the next part, acids and bases. Okay, because when we're talking about acids and bases, when we're talking about measuring pH, what this is you're measuring the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution. Okay, the concentration of hydrogen within a solution. Okay. So when we say that we're looking at this on a logarithmic scale, what we're saying here is we're looking at this in powers of 10. Okay, powers of 10. Okay, so what this means is, so you guys know the pH scale. The pH scale, if we say, goes from 1 to 14. Okay, basically as we go down the pH scale, that you become more acidic, and as you go up on the pH scale, your pH becomes more basic. Okay, so what we're saying here is, what we're saying here basically then is as you move up or down the pH scale, your hydrogen ion concentration changes. Okay, the more acidic you become, the higher the hydrogen ion concentration within your body fluid compartments. Okay, so what an acid is basically a hydrogen ion donor. Okay, meaning acids are molecules or compounds that release hydrogen ions. Okay, so if I take a certain molecule or compound and I mix it in water, okay, that water may make that molecular compound dissociate or release hydrogen ions from itself, and you'll have, and as a result, you'll have more free hydrogen ions, within this fluid. Okay, within this fluid. All right, so now when we talk about this from a logarithmic standpoint, okay, what we're saying here is, let's say again, I'm just making these numbers up, but let's say we're at a pH of 6, okay, and at this pH of 6, you have a hydrogen ion concentration of, let's just say for the sake of discussion, you have 100, okay, and let's say you drop 1 full point on the pH scale down to 5, your hydrogen ion concentration is going to increase tenfold. So at a pH of 5, you would have 1,000 hydrogen ions. Okay, then if you go down to a pH of 4, the concentration is gonna increase tenfold again. So you'd have 10,000. Okay, that's how this pH scale works. Okay. So basically, when we're at a neutral pH, when we're at a pH of 7. Okay, there's an equal amount of hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions. So basically, there aren't an excessive amount or not enough hydrogens. All right, so as a result, we are at, that's neutral. I mean, that's what distilled water is. Okay. So if you think of something that's acidic, like your stomach acid, hydrochloric acid in your stomach, that's a very strong acid. When we say something is a very strong acid, it very easily disassociates hydrogen ions. And when I say disassociate, I mean think of it as release. Okay. So, I mean, your stomach acid, I mean, is that about a pH of 2.5 to 3.5? That's very strong. Okay. So there's a lot of hydrogen ions in there, but that's good. I mean, it's good for its purpose, for its function. Okay, because as you're going to learn about as I get more in depth with this lecture, I've already kind of hit on this a little bit when I was talking about proteins. Remember, proteins have a specific shape to them. The shape of molecules is important. So weakened stomach acid is good for digesting because the hydrogen ions can kind of get in there and disrupt the shape of the protein. It can kind of make it uncoil a little more, and then it makes it easier to digest it. Okay, and that's also problematic if our body pH gets too low. Okay, if our pH drops too low, that's going to be deadly for us because our metabolism is driven by proteins called enzymes. Okay, and if our enzymes start to lose their shape, they start to lose their function as well. Okay, and if enzymes don't function properly, our metabolism doesn't function properly, and we don't function properly. Okay, and same thing with also, you know, with hemoglobin and oxygen transportation. If we get too acidic, we're going to have a hard time circulating oxygen around as well for this exact same purpose. Because you've heard of hemoglobin before. It's a protein on red blood cells. Okay, so you got a red blood cell, then you've got this pigment here. Okay, hemoglobin. Okay, oxygen sticks to that. Okay, if these proteins start to uncoil because our pH is too far off, we're going to release oxygen prematurely, and we're going to have a hard time circulating oxygen and sticking it to blood. Okay, so maintaining pH is very, very critical, and you know, and it's very easy. If we get too basic, the exact opposite is going to happen. Okay, what's going to happen are these, you know, the proteins are going to, without enough hydrogen ions in our body fluid compartments, okay, our proteins are going to coil in tighter, and again, their shape is going to be, well, different, and they're not going to function properly or at all. So again, our metabolism is going to go south, and our ability to circulate oxygen is going to get worse, except for here, what's going to happen is hemoglobin coils too tightly, we won't be able to release oxygen easily enough. Okay, so maintaining pH is very, very critical. But like I said, I mean, all pH is just looking at hydrogen ion concentration. That's all it really is. Okay. And one thing to bear in mind is, what do we do to resist changes in pH? And that's what we have, what are called buffers. Okay, and there are two types of buffers in the human body. There are what are called chemical and physiologic. Okay, when we say, so basically what a buffer does is a buffer resists changes in pH. Okay, so some kind of mechanism to resist a change in pH. Some kind of mechanism to resist too significant of an increase or too significant of a decrease of hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, and chemical buffers, you can probably guess what these are. These are actual chemicals. Okay, these are actual chemicals. Okay, very common one. Bicarbonate, okay, that's a very common extracellular buffer. So basically what happens is if we accumulate too much, hydrogen in our system, we use this bicarbonate molecule, and it combines with a hydrogen ion, and that will form something called carbonic acid. And then what happens is we break that carbonic acid, or we circulate, oops, it's supposed to be a C. Sorry. We circulate that carbonic acid around the body. And then as a result, what happens is that'll go to the lungs. We'll break it apart with an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And what you're left with is carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so what happens, we stick the extra hydrogen ions, so in a nutshell, we stick the extra hydrogen ions to a buffer. We then circulate that buffer to an area of the body, and then there are enzymes that break this apart, and now all we have left is water and carbon dioxide. You can figure out what we do from here. We exhale the carbon dioxide, and then all we're left with is water. It's a great little buffer. Okay, so that's a chemical buffer, a chemical that prevents us from an extreme pH change. And a physiologic buffer is an actual physiologic response. Okay, so for example, you guys can figure this out. If my pH becomes too acidic, so if my pH goes from 7.4 down to 7.1, I'm becoming acidic. My hydrogen ion concentration is going up. Okay, so as a result, if through this process, if I'm going to start developing more carbon dioxide, what's going to happen to my breath rate? Your breath rate's going to go up. You're going to exhale that excess carbon dioxide, or the excess CO2, and that's going to help you level off your pH. Okay, that's a physiologic buffer. Your breath rate going up, your kidneys excreting more hydrogen or retaining more bicarbonate is a physiologic buffer. Okay, so basically this is how we resist changes to pH, by using buffers. Okay, and then like I said, that's all pH is like I said, just think hydrogen ions when you're thinking pH. As you become more acidic, your hydrogen ion concentration goes up. As you become basic, your hydrogen ion concentration goes down. Okay. And like I said, acid-base balance, as you're kind of getting the picture based on this explanation, you're noticing that acid-base imbalances primarily affect the metabolism of our body. Okay, so that's what you're going to see with acid-base imbalances are metabolic problems, metabolic issues. Okay. So if you have any questions on this topic, again, feel free to email me. I already mentioned all this stuff on here already, enzyme activity, affinity of oxygen, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But again, if you have any questions on any of this stuff, again, I can't say this enough. Email me, contact me, ask questions, because I want to make sure this stuff sticks. Because like I said, the material you're learning in this, in these first few chapters, this is material that's never going to go away. Okay, you're just going to constantly see it used over and over and over again, except you're going to see it more applied to certain physiologic mechanisms. So you have to know this stuff. All right.